Oh, I got, never mind, Kim. You're on my 12. If we get disconnected, I'll call you right back. Kim,
Yeah,
you make 12, so if we
Guys
get
online.
disconnected, I'll call you right back.
okay.
'Cause we need you.
Online.
We're online.
All right, we're good. We're getting ready to start, so I'll put the phone down.
All right.
Ready? Commissioner Linker speaking. I'd like to take a moment to welcome everyone to our meeting. Apologize for the delay. We had some difficulties with some of our laptops and people calling in, so we want to give everybody a chance to have everything up and running. Thank you for joining us. We're going to start with the roll call.
Commissioner Tracy Arnold. Commissioners, if you're online, please unmute yourself when your name is called.
Tracy Arnold present. Do you hear me?
Yes, thank you. Commissioner Laura Austin. Commissioner Laura Austin. Commissioner Jody Autry.
Commissioner Autry present.
Commissioner Kelly Browning. Commissioner Kelly Browning. Commissioner Bill Cheshire. Commissioner Edward Coggins. Commissioner James Davis. Commissioner Angela Flowers.
Commissioner Flowers present.
Commissioner Aubrey Gadet. Commissioner Michelle Gray.
Commissioner Gray present.
Commissioner Don Hester.
Commissioner Hester present.
Commissioner Hannah Jimenez.
Commissioner Jimenez present.
Commissioner Kathleen Linker.
Commissioner Kathleen Linker present.
Commissioner Christopher Madden. Commissioner Susan Mills. Commissioner Lynn Moody. Commissioner Cassandra Morrison. Commissioner Morrison. I see Commissioner Morrison online, so we may come back to her. She may be having some tech issues. Commissioner Michelle Perry. Commissioner April Riddle.
Ma'am, I believe they just sent an email
with some connection issues.
Okay. Commissioner Riddle, are you able to speak? Looks like you're unmuted. Commissioner Kim Robertson?
Commissioner Kim Robertson, present.
Commissioner Lindsay Sice?
Commissioner Lindsay Sice, present.
Commissioner Lisa Sprinkle?
Commissioner Lisa Sprinkle, present.
Commissioner Stacy Wood? Commissioner Bill Cheshire?
Can you just say present? Commissioner William Cheshire, present.
Present.
Okay, so Commissioner Riddle has typed in Commissioner Riddle present. Commissioner Riddle, if you're able to speak at some point, we will really need for you to do so, but we'll go ahead and record you as present based on your message that you typed in on the webinar. Commissioner Morrison, are you able to join us? Mr. Morrison? It's showing that you're unmuted. I don't know if you can speak. All right, so we will have to just come back. I see that Commissioner Morrison is online. If she can type in a message as Commissioner Riddle did, that would be helpful. If not, then we'll come back to her. I'll keep monitoring for her attendance.
So that's quorum. We have quorum, correct?
So yes, we do have quorum.
So the first order on the agenda is the approval of minutes from the last meeting. If everyone's had a chance to look at the minutes from the February 21st meeting, I'd entertain a motion to accept.
Motion to accept.
I'll second that.
Motion accepted by Commissioner Chester, seconded by Commissioner Hester. All in favor?
Aye.
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 One on the phone. All opposed? So the agenda has been accepted. The next thing on our agenda would be our guests. We'd like to welcome and thank the ELA division for coming to present to us on our criteria sheet. Ms. Day, welcome.
Thank you. Good morning. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Again, good morning. We are here to talk about K-12 English Language Arts. We're going to do an overview. We're going to talk about the changes from the 2010 to the 2017 standards, and then we'll go over the criteria sheets. My name is Christy Day. I am the English Language Arts and Language Chief here at DPI, and then I'm going to let the team introduce themselves.
Good morning, I'm Lisa McIntosh, and I work with K-5 ELA.
And I'm Kelly Schultz, and I do 6 through 8 ELA. And I'm Stacy Daniel, I do 9-12.
All right, so that's the team, and we're here today to give some information about ELA, about English Language Arts, about the criteria sheets, and then answer any questions that you may have. Okay, so we have two objectives. We're going to provide an overview of the standards. Again, we're going to talk about the changes. We're going to talk broad changes between the 2010 and 2017 standards. There are grade-specific changes, but we will build that into our presentation when we work with the evaluators in July. But we wanted to give you information about those broad, big changes. And then we will explain the textbook criteria sheets at the end. Okay, so an overview. The 2017 ELA standards are actually in implementation this year. This is the first year of implementation. They were adopted in 2017. That's why they're called the 2017 standards. They were adopted or approved by the state board in April 2017, and they went into effect or into full implementation into this school year, 18-19 school year. Again, we're going to do big, broad. There are grade specific, but we will go deeper into those with the evaluators in July. One important note to make about the standards, just off the bat, is we are not a Common Core state anymore. These are North Carolina standards. So any materials that may state Common Core, just know that we are not a Common Core state any longer. These standards are North Carolina. They were reviewed, they were revised by North Carolina educators and fit the needs of North Carolina students. Okay, so we wanted to explain a little bit about the format and how the ELA standards are formatted. You can see this graphic here on the screen. We have strands. So there are 4 strands. There's reading, and within reading we have reading literature, reading information, and in K-5 we have reading foundational skills. There's writing, language, and then speaking and listening. So those are our big broad strands. Below that are the clusters, and these are topics that take a few or several standards, whatever it may be, and give a topic phrase about what all those standards are about, so how they're connected. For example, one of our clusters in reading is craft and structure. So those 3 or 4 standards that fall underneath craft and structure all have to do with craft and structure. Okay? And these clusters are consistent K-12. Okay? And then below that we have the anchor standards. These are career and college ready broad expectations. So when the students leave us at the end of their K-12 educational journey, they should have met these expectations so that they're ready to go into the workforce or into college. And then below that we have grade level standards. These are very specific, and there's one-to-one correspondence with the grade level standards and the anchor standards. So you're going to see how grade level standards build to get to that career and college ready anchor standard. The grade level standards are also end of year expectations or end of course, whichever is applicable. So those are end of year, end of course expectations. In front of you, you have some materials. These are Understanding the North Carolina ELA Standard Course of Study documents. These were created after the standards were approved by the State Board in 2017. North Carolina educators came together and created a resource that gave a little more information about the standards. We heard through the review and revision process that a lot of the standards were strong, they were good, they were appropriate, but they just needed a little bit more support. So this was a resource that came out of that. It is also linked. If you have the PowerPoint, it's also linked, and it can be found electronically if you prefer that. But we wanted to be sure that you had these resources in paper form. Okay. So if you want to you can pick any one you want to, and you want to open it up. I'm going to kind of explain just a little bit about what's in here and how it's set up. Okay, so within this document, you're going to see the purpose, and then you'll see the CCR anchor standards on the other side of that purpose page, and then that's where the true document begins. There are 3 columns. You have standard, clarification, and glossary. Under standards, you're also going to notice that those clusters are there. So for the very first one in reading, there's key ideas and evidence. So we also made sure to put clusters in there for teachers to understand how those standards are connected and what topic brings them together. Okay. Also, you're going to see the standard notation. So RL.K.1, whatever it may be. And then there's the actual standard next to the notation. Notice that within the standard there are some bold words. Throughout the revision process, teachers were able to give input on which words were appropriate, but which ones needed a little more clarification or support. That there were, we heard a lot that there wasn't consistency across the board on what, the understanding of key details or retail is. So we worked to make sure there was some consistency there. So you have bolded words there, and I'll come back to that when we talk about the glossary. In the middle is the clarification, and there's a sentence or two that does just that. It clarifies the standard so that teachers can look at it maybe in a different way. It's still aligned to the standard, but it's just said in a different way to give a little more information. And then below that, there are in the classroom ideas. These are little snippets of instruction that are aligned to the standards. The standard doesn't have to be taught this way. This is just an idea of how could it be taught in an aligned manner. Teachers can take these in the classroom snippets and build it into their lessons, or they can expand upon it and make fuller lessons or make it whatever they need it to be for their classroom.
Excuse me, Dr. Zhang.
Yeah.
For those of you who are participating online, someone needs to mute. There's a lot of noise coming from somewhere. So if you could just mute yourself until you get ready to talk so that we can all hear Dr. Dale's presentation. Thank you.
Thanks. And then the third column is the glossary, and this connects back to those bolded words in the standards. You're going to see definitions with those bolded words. The purpose is to help educators and parents, because this is open, it's a public document, parents can go in there and check it out, to understand what those terms mean. It doesn't mean you're going to teach that term the same way in every grade, but it's a consistent understanding across the state of what that means. Okay? Does anyone have any questions about the understanding document? Anything so far? Okay. All right, so let's jump into the standards. We're going to start with the reading strand. Again, these are major changes, not the nitty-gritty nuts and bolts of the grade level standards. We're going to break it down into the three parts of this reading strand: foundational skills, literature, and informational text. Okay, so what we did with these slides is we have the 2010, so the older standard, and then we compared it to the 2017, just to kind of show you the differences here. In reading foundational, there was one major change between the two standards. The writers heard from teachers across the state that we need handwriting. So there's handwriting within the standards, but it was kind of in different places. You'll notice in 2010, in kindergarten and first grade, it was over in the language standards. But then when you got into third, fourth, and fifth with the cursive, it was in writing. So teachers said, I don't even know if cursive's in the standards. Where is cursive? We got that question a lot. So the writer said, let's put it into one strand within foundational skills. And that's what they did. And they built a nice progression there from K to 5, where it starts with printing, upper and lower, and then all the way into creating readable documents through legible handwriting and cursive. They noticed the second grade did not have a handwriting standard. So that was something that they researched, and a brand new standard for the 2017 standards is that RF22, a handwriting standard for second grade. Senate Bill 115C-81, which is also known the Back to Basics Bill, states that the standard course of study shall include the requirement that the public schools provide instruction in cursive writing so students create readable documents through legible cursive handwriting by the end of 5th grade. So it's within our standards, but it's also legislation that cursive be in the standards and be taught in the classroom. Okay? A lot of times too, so schools and districts can make a choice here, and a lot of times cursive starts in 2nd grade, but again, that's a district choice. Okay. All right, the next one is with RL and RI2. You'll notice in blue, it's kind of hard to see, but you notice in blue we kind of showed the differences here. There was some confusion around theme and central idea. In RL, the previous standard, 2000, said theme or central idea of a text, and that caused some confusion. So we designated theme for literature and central idea for informational, and this kind of highlights that. Teachers were teaching it this way, but they often would question it. So the verbiage should be theme with RL, literature, and then central idea with informational text. And this change technically begins in grade 6. The previous grades below already had this, but this technically begins in grade 6 through grades 12. Okay. RL and RI4, you'll see this is actually the anchor standard. Since technical, connotative, and figurative meanings already existed in a language standard in L5, the writers decided to remove them from RL and RI4 to place a greater emphasis on meaning and tone. So this really hones in or focuses in on those words and phrases in a text and how students analyze those specific word choices and how they shape meaning and tone within a text. So that is kind of laser focused into that skill with these two standards. Okay. RL and RI6, the change here. In R6, writers acknowledge the confusion between point of view and perspective. It kind of went back and forth, point of view, some grades, and some grades were perspective. When interpreting the standards, some teachers use point of view and perspective interchangeably, even though they're not synonymous. So by adding perspective, the writers made more of a distinction between point of view, which is often, you know, first person, third person, and actually a perspective. So that opinion of where that person reflected, what they saw that action or that event as. And this change affects RL more than it does RI, because RI is more point of view or purpose if you think about informational text. But with literature, perspective definitely fits with some of these standards. It begins in grade 7. So you'll notice in grade 7 and up, it is perspective. RL and RI10. These two standards now include independent sustained reading and connecting prior knowledge and experiences to text. The writers decided to add this based on research. So this standard has been known as our text complexity standard, thinking about how students are moving up the staircase of text complexity to read more complex text as they move through grade levels. But an important piece of being able to read those complex texts is to be able to do it independently and for periods of time. And also, you'll notice the last sentence there in the 2017 standard says, connect prior knowledge and experiences to text. That's important because when students are making connections, or when they're comprehending a text, they have to use their old knowledge to make new knowledge, or their prior knowledge to understand that text and make new knowledge. Okay. Also, another change is in 2010 we had, by the end of the year, read and comprehend literature, including stories and poetry. So the writers took out those specific genres and subgenres because technically this is a curricular choice. Teachers and schools are making those choices. LEAs are making the choices about what type of genres to read. Okay. Another important note here is when we're talking about independent sustained reading, we're not talking about, you know, SSR, drop everything and read. This is a specific strategy to use in the classroom. So students are getting very explicit direct instruction, and when they're independently reading, they're taking those skills and those things they've done in that direct instruction and practicing it. Another thing also that we get questioned about, and the writers had very in-depth conversations around this, was the sustained periods of time. People want to know, well, in second grade, how many minutes is that? And the point was not to have minutes per grade. It was just, it depends on the student. So as long as students are growing in their sustained periods of time, you differentiate that for your students. Okay, so those are the major changes within the reading strand. Are there any questions before we go into writing? Okay. Writing strand. We're going to talk a little bit about some changes around text types, and then within the writing strand, we also have research. This strand was majorly reorganized. We heard from educators across the state that there are a lot of standards, and there were ways that we could combine and integrate or embed standards together, so there weren't so many. This one was, so what happened? The writers decided to take the 3 standards over here in 2010, W4, W5, W10, and absorb it or move it into the 3 text types, which is W1, W2, and W3. Argument writing, informative, and then narrative. The idea here is so that it emphasizes more the complete writing process. It was very disjointed, having different standards. Teachers were teaching it in a very organized and coherent, complete manner, but by having it in the standard, it helps them really see how you do go through the entire, pretty much the entire, excuse me, writing process with these 3 text types. So they added a piece for A about organizing, pre-planning, to prepare for their writing. And then the very last substandard talks about developing and strengthening their writing. So revising, editing, rewriting, trying a new approach, thinking about task, purpose, and audience. So they took some of those pieces and parts of W4, W5, and W10 and absorbed it into those three text types of W1, W2, and W3. Another change, which we don't have a slide for this, but W10, it was absorbed into 2017, but also if you think about writing, you do want to write to the text type, but if you're responding to a reading, that would be an expectation of the reading standards. And I'm sorry, not W10, W9, excuse me. W9 was omitted because it's an expectation of the reading standards. And W9 just talked about responding to reading. So we read a text, we read a piece of text, and then a student writes in response to that text, whatever the task may be. That is an expectation of the reading standards and not necessarily a writing standard. And then W6, we just had some terminology change here. Instead of saying technology, the writers put digital tools and resources to align with the North Carolina digital learning competencies. We wanted to make sure we were in line with that. So that verbiage has changed. And those are the major changes of writing. So does anyone have any questions before we move on to language? Okay. Language, there were some major changes that took place within the language strand.
Let me check online.
Sure. Yeah, we'll pause.
Ma'am, Commissioner Cheshire, just one quick question.
Yes.
Is it my understanding that these, and this is kind of in line with Dr. Fair as well, feel free, either one of you to answer, are these documents, the guiding documents, as we look at the prospective textbooks that may be implemented this year? So as we balance the content of the books, if we balance the content of the books against the standard, we should be pretty close.
Right.
Is kind of the driving thought here.
Right. So it provides more information about the standard. So if you wanted to, if you saw this standard, you're like, well, I don't know what it may look like in instruction, that's the guidance document to go to provide a little more information.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
So for our online attendees, if you have a question, if you would unmute yourself and ask your question. I don't see any questions in the questions or chat pane. So if you have any questions, if you would please unmute yourself.
And again, these are open, so anyone can access these. There's no password. They're on our website. We blast it down on listserv, so anybody can access these. Okay? Okay. Language. Within the language strand, we have conventions of standard English. We have knowledge of language, and then vocabulary acquisition and use. Oops. Did I turn it on? There we go. Okay. The writers heard a lot of feedback from educators in the field around language, the first two language standards, so around L1 and L2. They heard there's not enough time to teach these. They heard there's too many of them. They heard I don't understand some of these terms. I don't understand how to teach some of these. So there was a lot of feedback around that, and they put a lot of thought into what can we do to help with this then. You'll notice that in second grade, the substandards used to be A through F. Now, in the new standard, it talks about a continuum. So there are two continuums now. And this is just a snapshot. You have the full ones within your understanding documents. In each one, you'll see the full for L1 and L2. Okay? And then behind that, you'll also see some clarification, some support around these continuums to really highlight and show what this would look like in instruction. So the idea behind these is they were revised. So the first one for L1 is grammar, focuses on grammar. L2 focuses on conventions. And the standards, the substandards that used to be A, B, C, D, and so on, are still within there, but they're built into grade bands now. So there's K1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 9, 12. And we highlighted 2, 3 here. So you'll notice that they're not separated by grade, they're separated by grade band. The idea is so that teachers are teaching these, students are getting instruction and practice across multiple grades. So they have more time to really master these language skills. In the lower grade band, so for example, if we're looking at 2, 3, in grade 2, teachers are introducing and modeling the skill for students. In the higher grade of the band, students, are applying this skill to more complex text as they work through the semester. So they're getting more independent. This allows for some differentiation. If a student is ready for more complex text, even in second grade, teachers have the flexibility to be able to do that. High school looks a little different. The writer said, well, by high school, students should have these language skills so that they can apply them and create their unique style and their voice when writing, when speaking. So for high school teachers, what they're going to want to do is they're going to formatively assess and see where those gaps are and use mini lessons to fill in those gaps for students. Okay. So this is one of the major changes of the ELA standards overall, are these language continuas. And again, there are, within the understanding document, you have it, but then afterwards, you have this nice chart that talks about how do you introduce and model some ideas, not the only way, but some ideas to do it, and then how do you build upon those skills. And teachers across the state wrote these. Okay? All right. Another change comes with L4 and L5. Word relationships, you'll notice word relationships were within L5, and the writers took it out of L5 and put it into L4 because they felt like it fit better. If you're thinking about L4, that's determining and clarifying the meaning of unknown words and phrases based on reading and context. So how do you do that? Well, you use context clues, word parts, and word relationships. Okay. They felt like it was a much better fit here. You'll notice that the substandards are not listed within the standard in 2017. The writers took the substandards and put it within the clarification. So it's not necessarily a part of the standard, but it is a way to teach that standard. Okay. Another change here, and it's a smaller change, but it can make a huge instructional impact. If you look at the determine or clarify for 2010, but now it says determine and or clarify, because there are times where students have to determine and clarify, and there are times where they determine or clarify. It depends on the student, what they know about that word, and the instruction taking place. So a small change, but it could have some impact instructionally. Okay. And this kind of piggybacks on that. So L5, again, word relationships, it was removed from L5 and it was moved into L4. So the substandard that went with L5, word relationships, moved over to L4, clarification. And now L5 is really focused in on figurative language and the nuances of word meanings. And it did keep those substandards that correspond with figurative language and nuances. And then L6, this is also a smaller change, but it is a change in terminology. Before, if you come down to the bottom here, it talks about demonstrate independence and gathering vocabulary knowledge. The writer said, well, teachers instructionally, and if you're thinking about students, they're not really gathering, they're developing their vocabulary knowledge. So they changed that gathering to developing, because that is what we want students to do, to develop that vocabulary knowledge so that when they encounter that unknown word or term, they know what to do. Okay, any questions about language strand before we go to speaking and listening? That one probably had the biggest or the most major changes. Okay. Our last strand is speaking and listening, and within this we have collaboration and communication, and then presentation of knowledge and ideas. We heard from teachers across the state that, they really didn't want a lot of changes to this strand. They felt they were strong. They felt that they fit well developmentally. So the only revision was Standard 6 was integrated into Standard 4. So it reduced the number of standards, and really it fits better. It makes it a much stronger or richer standard by combining the two, by adapting speech within them when they present claims and findings. And actually in high school, the skills were already there. The change just took place in K-8. The important thing to remember about speaking and listening is that it should be there, right? So it should be explicit, it should be evident, it should be integrated into reading, into writing, into language. A lot of times, speaking and listening can be kind of to the side and not as purposeful and integrated as it should be. And a lot of times teachers, if they just have kids turn and talk, they think that that's speaking and listening, when there are actually very specific and very rich standards that could guide some of that conversation and have students go deeper and make much stronger communication, stronger listening skills within those discussions. So any questions with that one, because that was just one change within that strand. Okay. All right, so anything before we move on to criteria sheets? Okay. All right. So we're not going to go through every single point on the criteria sheets. We pulled out some that we felt might need a little more explanation specific for ELA, or some that are very specific to ELA that we might want to just kind of highlight. So we're going to go through each part, and then after each part, if you have questions or concerns or statements or anything you want to make, we'll stop for questions. There's a K-5 and then there's a 6-12. There aren't a lot of differences here, but as we go through, we'll kind of highlight the difference between the K-5 and 6-12 and what that might look like. Do you have the criteria sheets in front of you?
We have them in our folder.
Perfect. Okay, so what we're going to do, if you'll just take a moment to read through just part 1, and you can choose, actually, if you'll read, I don't think there are any differences in this one, right? K-12 and 6. I don't think there are any differences. So pick one on this one, and if you'll just read part 1, and then we'll make some points about part 1.
Yeah, we're still here. Are you here?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, what? Yeah, I'm trying to keep the phone away so you don't hear it. All right.
Does anybody need a minute? Is everybody good? Excuse me. Okay, so we're just going to make a couple points. Not that these are the most important pieces of it. We just felt like there might be, you might need a little more explanation with it. Part 1, content. The first one was A, materials present main concepts that support a minimum of 80% of the grade level expectations in the ELA standard courses study. We just wanted to point this out, that there is that 80%, which is critical to make sure that these materials are aligned to the standard courses study. And then, of course, we have our substandards within that, which as a substandard, the substandards kind of explain that main standard. So you have a bigger, broader main standard, and those sub really get the pieces and parts that make up that main standard. The next one we wanted to point out was B, and this was around the selections or the text. one important point here is around what is a text? What is a selection? And a text can be a number of things. It can be an infographic, it can be a piece of art, it can be a piece of music, it can be a map, it can be a poem, it can be a biography, it can be a recipe. So text is, that term is very broad in what that actually looks like. And then worth reading closely. So that just speaks to the importance of making sure that there's meat within that text so that students can build knowledge, so they can pull out that vocabulary, so that teachers can have those text-dependent questions that go real deep. There has to be something there that students are going to glean information, knowledge, vocabulary, whatever it may be. There's got to be enough there for that. Exhibit exceptional craft and thought. It has to be well written. It has to be a nice structure to that text, whatever the structure may be. So it has to be it has to be appropriately complex, which we'll talk about in just a minute. And then from a variety of genres and cultures. You want to make sure there's a variety of genres within it, and then there's diversity. And we're going to talk about diversity a couple times as we go through the criteria. When we talk about selections and we talk about text that we should be choosing in the classroom, we talk about text complexity. And then there are 3 measures within text complexity, and we'll go deeper with the evaluators around text complexity. We look at quantitative, excuse me, which is kind of the difficulty level, like the Lexile is very popular in North Carolina. Qualitative, which is the level of themes, structure, the vocabulary knowledge that needs to be there, any kind of hidden or layered meanings within the text. And then reader and tasks. So you're thinking about your students as readers, but then you're also thinking about what am I going to have students, or what am I going to ask students to do with this text? What is the task that goes along with that? If it's a really complex task, the complexity of the text might be a little bit lower, okay, because you're asking them to put a lot of thought in a really complex task. So there are a lot of things to think about with that, but we will go into more detail with the evaluators. Those are the pieces we wanted to point out for part 1 for the content. Do you have any questions around part 1?
Does anyone online have any questions? If so, unmute yourself.
Okay. Part 2, if you'll take just a minute to read through part 2.
Commissioner Linker, while everybody's reading part 2, there's quite a few new commission members, so this will be their first criteria sheet. Can you go back up to the first part and look at D?
Sure.
Just maybe make sure there's some clear understanding of what the intent is of that. I, as a commissioner that's been a while and a ELA reading coach, I understand what it is, but just for clarification for the newer commissioners.
For part 1D?
D.
Yep. I will. I'll let everybody read through part 2 and then I'll back up. has everyone had an opportunity to read part 2? Okay, so I'll back up. That's a great point. Thank you. So in part 1 content, if you look down at D, it says materials include teacher resources, which provide information and opportunities for teachers to increase their own understanding of the concepts specific to ELA. So within the resources or within the materials, it's really important that teachers understand what they're teaching. So if we were talking about, if there's a lesson on onset and rhyme, there should probably be some explanation of onset and rhyme so teachers understand what that is so that they have the knowledge when they teach it. So there should be some concepts in there that are very specific to ELA that are explicit within the materials and explained, maybe some teacher notes or however it's organized. There should definitely be within the materials that should be happening. Okay.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks. Okay, part 2, pedagogy. We wanted to just point out a couple things here. So for A, and this has to do all about integration. And integration is really key in ELA because there are a lot of standards. And for students to truly have a strong grasp of those individual standards, you have to integrate. Because if you're thinking about reading, you want to speak about reading. If you're writing, you have to understand those language standards. And you also want to make sure that your writing is connected to text or to tasks that students have been doing. So it must be real purposeful. The integration must be purposeful. We're not having speaking just kind of to the side just to say we're speaking. We're not just writing about a very isolated event that doesn't have anything to do with the reading or the speaking and listening or the language that the language skills that the students were just practicing or what instruction took place. Okay, so it should be very meaningful, very purposeful. Another important part around this is grammar. So grammar should be integrated within the writing piece, right? Grammar within context so that students can start making those connections and can see it in their reading and can start using it in their writing, see it in their writing, those skills, okay? And this does connect, so a lot of these criteria kind of connect together, and it does hit on or connect with G, which talks about that language, the grammar and language conventions in context of reading, writing, and or speaking. So that those two are very similar or kind of pair nicely together. For B, materials should include read alouds, guided reading, suggested for paired text, shared and independent reading. So this kind of speaks to a variety of texts for different reasons. If you're thinking about a reading block or thinking about how reading is taught, you use these materials, you use these texts for different reasons. Okay? And then this does go back to part 1 when we think about selections are worth reading closely. That goes back to a lot of the guided reading piece. And when we think about paired text, we think about putting texts together that are a common concept or theme so that students really are making connections and building the vocabulary about that theme or topic. Okay. And then the text complexity piece also plays a big part in this one because it must be appropriately complex for the student, for the grade, but also for your purpose. If you're doing a read aloud, especially in elementary, that read aloud text should be at a higher complexity than what a student can actually read independently, so that they're getting the vocabulary and the knowledge. They're hearing fluency with read aloud, so they hear how fluent readers read, different skills like that. E talks about emphasizing author's craft and style for students to imitate and or create. So this speaks to mentor text. It also goes back to part 1 where we talk about selections exhibit exceptional craft and thought. So the text in there, students oftentimes will want to imitate when they write what they've read. So if the text within the materials are of an exceptional craft and structure and of thoughtful and they're deep and worthwhile, students can take that and transfer that into their writing. So there's a lot of research around that about how important that is. And then with F, this one is where it differs a little bit for 612 and K5. This is speaking to foundational skills, concepts of print, phonological awareness, phonics, fluency. This is really important that the foundational skills within the materials we talk about explicit and systematic. So they should build and they should be very explicit in their teaching so that students are getting those foundational skills that they need as they read more complex texts and become better readers. Okay. Couple more points for part 2. This one is H. This one speaks to academic vocabulary. And here we're talking about, excuse me, those words that really impact the story. A lot of times the materials will pull out vocabulary lists. Teachers choose their own vocabulary words, and we talk to teachers about, well, which words are you choosing? Are you choosing words that are high utility that they're going to see across grade levels, see in different content areas, words that might have multiple meanings, words that are part of word families? Those are the words that we really want to spend time on and instruction on so that students are really getting the most bang for their buck, because we're limited on time within instruction. So if we can do those types of vocabulary lessons, it's going to go a long way. When it talks about word identification strategies, excuse me, we're really talking about being able to use like word parts, context clues, those types of things that will help them understand the meaning of those vocabulary words. This one speaks to writing. So writing should always be connected to the text that they read or the tasks that they're doing. We're not thinking of, and I love the example that we always use, it's not imagine a time you're on a magic carpet ride. Because you want students to have the knowledge to be able to write. And so if we're all reading the text or we're really grappling with the text, we're having instruction within the text, we're reading it closely, we're understanding the text, that gives students an opportunity to write about that. We also want a range of tasks, purposes, audiences, and selections. So within our writing standards, we have argument writing, narrative, and then informative. So there should be a range there. L, text-dependent questions. Students should be going back into the text to answer the questions. These types of questions should be aligned to the standards and to the depth of the standards. You're also wanting to pick pieces of the text that are important. You know, what color was Susie's shirt in chapter 2? Probably has an impact on the text. The type of places that we're asking students to go back to and really explore and dive deep and analyze and synthesize should be really important to the understanding and comprehension of that text. And then N, that is differentiation. So there should be scaffolds, supports, extensions, something for all types of learners or all levels of learners. And we're going to come back to this again. You'll see this in some different criteria as we go forward. But it is important that those different levels are addressed in instruction. When we talk about lessons, we talk about, when we help with some lesson planning, we talk about you want to help scaffold for the students that can't access that complex text or be able to do that task. So you don't lower the text complexity or you don't lower the text, you up the scaffold. So they might need some vocabulary support before they read. They might need some chunking to help with the scaffolding and with their comprehension, but you want them in that text complexity band. And then if they're ready to extend, you can extend that into some more complex tasks, some complex text, we can extend that. Okay? So those are the pieces and parts that we wanted to really pinpoint for part 2. But if you have any questions about these or any of the other ones, we'll take a moment for questions or comments.
We're pausing for questions, so if anyone online has any questions, please unmute.
Okay, well, if you think of one, you're welcome to interrupt me. If you'll take a minute to read part 3, accessibility, and then we'll talk about some very specific ones. Is everybody ready? Everybody have a chance? Okay. This is the longest part, but a lot of these are pretty standard. So we'll point out a few that are maybe ELA specific or need a little more explanation. The first one is inaccuracy A2, and it talks about the treatment of social issues, religion, ethnicity, and so on. Then this one does go back to where we talked about diverse and having text from different cultures, different genres. The important part here is that all viewpoints are presented in a manner that is balanced and objective. So despite whatever the topic may be, it should be balanced, objective, and in an academic manner. B1, which talks about grade level rigor, scaffolding, and extensions. Again, we kind of hit on this when we talked about differentiation. The grade level standard expectations are there, and they should not be lowered. What you do is you use scaffolding to bring your students there. You give them the tools they need to be at that level. And then, of course, you've got the other side where they're extending. But you want to be sure that you're not lowering the grade level expectations and you're not lowering the text complexity. You're giving students the tools to get there. If you lower the grade level expectations, so a lot of this, the standards are very rich, and there are lots of parts and pieces to it. If you just take one part of a standard and you're just teaching or focusing on that one part and you're not paying attention to the rest of it, you're actually teaching that standard at a much lower level, because the standards were built to build. They build. So if you're just teaching that one part, more than likely you're teaching at a much lower grade level, instead of meeting the expectation of the standard within that grade level. And then the bottom one is B4, and that's text layout is appropriate and it doesn't distract. So the focus should be on the text here, and there shouldn't be a lot of things that would distract a student's attention. So you want to limit those distractions. But again, a text can be a lot of different things. It can be an infographic. It can be a piece of art, a piece of music. So we're not just talking about words on a page. It can be a lot of things, and there can be really purposeful and really important illustrations, especially in the lower grades and even in the higher grades, that go along with that text that help students make meaning. Okay. All right. So C1, and it goes back to making sure that the materials are sufficient in depth and breadth to adequately address those grade level expectations, and then in a logical manner. And again, if you're not doing it to the depth that it should be, you're teaching it or you're covering it or you're instructing it, students are learning it at a much lower level than what that grade level expectation is. And it should be logical. So there are a lot of standards that fit well together. It goes back to integration that helps students really make meaning. It needs to be in a very logical way. And then C4, again, this again hits on diversity and representing these diverse perspectives in a very balanced and objective manner. So that if there's one perspective, there should be a balance of perspectives. There should be other perspectives, so that students are learning about that topic fully and holistically. It should be factual and objective, but you're seeing a balance of those perspectives. Okay. All right, now we're into D. The first one is D3, and depending on which, it might be DC, depending on which one you have. But materials are well organized, easy to use, comprehensive, durable, reasonably sized, with sufficient material for student use. Because it kind of goes back to the question earlier. It's really important that the teacher manual is organized cleanly and well organized, because of the way that the ELA standards are developed, or the way that they are set up. So we have strands and we have integration, so it can get real messy if those materials aren't well organized and easy to understand where that integration takes place and how all the pieces and parts fit together. D5 talks about the teacher's edition. It supports and provides help in using a variety of teaching strategies. It goes back to differentiation, making sure the needs of all the students are met, EC, ESL, AIG, depending on the students, so that all those needs are being met. Okay. And again, the teacher edition really needs to have some strong organization that makes sense for teachers. And then E, we're not going to, excuse me, go in depth with E because I know Donna's going to talk about that a little bit later, but we talk a lot about technology in ELA and how you shouldn't just tag on technology just for technology's sake. It should enhance the standards, enhance the instruction, and not distract from that. That's really important, especially when we're working with some text. There's a lot of technology that you can integrate with ELA, which is wonderful and can really meet a lot of needs of different types of learners. You know, it can help text be current and accurate, equitable, and accessible. It just needs to be done in a very strategic way. Okay, so questions?
Do you have any questions online?
Do you have any questions?
No.
Okay. I heard the phone rattling.
Thank you for your work with the commission. We really appreciate all the time and effort it goes into this. We know how important, we know how important it is to have aligned materials for North Carolina teachers and students, so we really do appreciate the work and effort that goes into it. All right, that's all I had. Yeah, thank you. And you're free to keep, these are yours.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we would now be having a break. Up next would be digital resources with Donna Murray. We will reconvene it at, we're about 5 minutes early, so let's come back about 10:55.